Happy Friday, everybody. It's the Fantasy Football Today podcast presented by BetMGM, the sports book born in Vegas. I'm Jamie Eisenberg. That's Dave Richard. That's Heath Cummings. It's a different cast of characters for us here on a Friday. Our buddy Adam Mazer is taking the day off. He's actually traveling to come see us. So he's going to be in a different studio next week. Hopefully we'll be able to do some podcasts live. And as we discussed on our Thursday night mailbag, which we'll be able to hear on Saturday morning, the audio version, maybe we'll steal his wallet again if we're so lucky. So should be a fun couple of days coming up next week, starting on Sunday. And don't forget, Sunday, you can check us out YouTube at 11:30 a.m. Eastern, CBS Sports HQ at 10 a.m. Eastern. Guys, what do you think about that game last night? The snow fest between the Browns and the Steelers. Browns winning that game 24-19. Just your overall thoughts. Dave, I'll start with you.
I was amused by it, obviously. It was fun watching the snow come down, and where it's a reminder that we're entering that time of year where you really need to stay on top of the weather before any outdoor game. We saw Jameis Winston attempt just 27 passes. I don't know how many he attempted in the first quarter. It felt like the entire first quarter of that game was a throwaway. And then both offenses were like, hey, wait a minute. We can throw the ball a little bit. Let's just throw it. And so for three quarters, certainly more so in the second half than the second quarter, we got treated to kind of a quasi shootout. It wasn't exactly something that worked out for every wide receiver. It certainly didn't work out for the quarterbacks, but it was an entertaining game. It was awesome to see Nick Chubb score twice. If he was on your bench, that kind of stinks. And I think this was the type of game where you would expect Najee Harris to not only get a lot of work, but do well with it. It's the snow. It's the Browns without their best linebacker playing. Najee had been running well for several weeks, and he really, really disappointed to the point where Jaylen Warren not only had a touchdown, Jaylen Warren looked better, and Jaylen Warren dominated playing time. He had, let me call it up real quick, he had 57% of the snaps, both of their snaps inside the 5, 13 of 16 snaps on third down. I don't know if it's happening, Jamie and Heath. I don't know if we're getting Jaylen Warren as the lead back in Pittsburgh quite yet, but last night, Thursday night, he was the lead guy.
I think the nice thing was, like, we told a lot of people, or I did at least, I didn't really want to start Nick Chubb. And I think a lot of people with 6 teams on a bye, if they had Nick Chubb on their roster, probably didn't have a choice. And so not really a good game for him, but he scored 2 touchdowns and he helped you out and he scored double-digit fantasy points. That's great. Jerry Jeudy looks like the number one. He's had 14 fantasy points. That's great. I'm on HQ in about 4 hours, and we do kind of a panicometer. And I had to send in the names for that. And I thought about sending in Najee Harris because, like, is it happening? Is it time to panic on Najee? We've seen a lot of times over the last 3 years or 2 years where it looked like, ooh, Jaylen Warren might be taking the lead job, and then it usually doesn't happen.
All right, so let's go through some of the numbers from last night's game. Again, Browns 24, Steelers 19. We'll start with Pittsburgh. So we got the quarterback tandem that I think a lot of people were concerned about if you were starting or buying into Russell Wilson. He was 270 and a touchdown, 3 carries for 10 yards, lost a fumble. Justin Fields attempted 1 pass. It was incomplete. He did have 3 carries for 26 yards. Seems like he sparked the offense a little bit with his big run there to set up what felt like, Pittsburgh taking the lead. You guys touched on this a little bit. So Najee Harris, 16 for 41, 2 catches, 13 yards on 2 targets. Jaylen Warren, 11 for 45 and a touchdown, 3 carries for 19 yards on 5 targets. It was not a good game for the pass catchers that we rely on for the Steelers. Are we done with Mike Williams? Are we just dropping him at this point? No catches for the second game in a row?
Yep.
Yeah.
Unfortunate there. George Pickens, 4 for 48 and 7 targets. We'll see if there's going to be a revenge game next time these two teams met after Newsom says fake tough guy after the little scuffle there at the end of the game. So we'll see how that goes next time these two teams meet up in a couple of weeks. Calvin Austin did have a touchdown, but I don't think anybody's buying into him. 3 targets. He had 3 catches, 78 yards, and the score. And not a bad game for Pat Freiermuth. 4 catches, 59 yards on 4 targets. For Cleveland, Jameis Winston, 219 and the interception. He also scored a rushing touchdown, but lost a fumble. Dave touched on this. The 2 touchdowns for Nick Chubb is now 3 yards per carry in each of his 4 games back. So he's not running well, 20 for 59. You got lucky, I think, with the 2 touchdowns from a fantasy perspective. But he scored them, give him credit, and the Steelers continue to give up rushing touchdowns. So just keep that in mind for their future opponents. Jerome Ford, are we done with him? 4 carries, 19 yards, 1 catch for 8 yards. Is it just we have to wait to see if maybe Nick Chubb has to miss any time before we buy into Jerome Ford?
Yep.
Handcuff.
Heath mentioned this. Jerry Jeudy, 6 for 85, 6 targets. Is it clear like he's just the number one receiver right now for Cleveland?
You'd like to say that, and in terms of production, it is like it's now 4 games, and he's been good in 3 of them. But if you look at targets, like he had 6, Elijah Moore had 5, David Njoku had 5, Tillman had 4 and left with a concussion. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a week where one of these guys has 10 and Jeudy has 8.
But it is still, the numbers without Amari Cooper, with Jameis Winston, have been pretty solid, and you just see like in a good spot, in a tough spot, he's leaning on Jerry Jeudy quite a bit. You mentioned Cedric Tillman leaving with the concussion, so he's in the concussion protocol. We'll see what happens going into week 13, but you might be without Cedric Tillman. You might want to bench Cedric Tillman anyway, just based on the lack of production the last 2 weeks. But again, who knows how that game would have finished when he did suffer the concussion in the second half. Elijah Moore, 3 for 21. So 2 good games, 2 bad games with Jameis Winston now. So again, we'll see what happens moving forward, and really nothing to worry about. I think with David Njoku, he's going to have bad games every now and then. 1 catch for 9 yards. This was bad, but also tough.
Touchdown.
I'm sorry.
He dropped a touchdown.
And he dropped a touchdown. Yeah. So, it's not going to be smooth sailing with all these guys. We said that going into the week, that there's going to be times where when you have 4 pass catchers like this that are all commanding targets, not everybody's going to be productive week in, week out. But, hopefully David Njoku bounces back after this game and may benefit if Cedric Tillman is going to miss any time. So there's your recap of Browns, Steelers. Again, Browns 24, Steelers 19. The Snow Bowl, first snow game that we had all season, is now in the books, and hopefully we get a few more moving forward if you are so inclined to like those type of matchups. There you go. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code FANTASY, and you will get up to – I skipped ahead too far, so I missed the read. So let's start that again. There we go. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code FANTASY, and you'll get up to $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code FANTASY, FANTASY. Deposit at least $10 and place your first wager on any game. You'll receive up to $1,500 in bonus bets if your first bet loses. Just make sure you use bonus code FANTASY, FANTASY, when you sign up. That's your BetMGM sponsorship there. Hopefully they don't hate me for butchering that one. All right, so again, we have a couple things coming up. We recorded our mailbag on Thursday night. You can hear the audio on Saturday, but you can watch it again if you want to on YouTube. It was a fun episode with myself, Dan, and Adam. On Sunday morning at 11:30 a.m. Eastern, that you catch us on YouTube answering all of your questions. It's on YouTube only, so check that out, 11:30 a.m. Sunday. And if you want to wake up a little earlier than that, 10 a.m. Eastern on CBS Sports HQ, it's our NFL and fantasy pregame show. This week we'll have Bryant McFadden joining us with Logan Ryan, Tommy Tran, Pete Prisco, and myself. Give you a full look at the entire NFL slate for the week and give you some fantasy advice as well. So there's what you want to do on Sunday morning. All right, let's get into some injuries, news, and notes before we take our first break. So we'll start with the quarterback position, and I want to get your guys' thoughts on this, and Heath, you specifically because of the dynasty value. So Daniel Jones basically said goodbye yesterday. It was an emotional speech. It sounded as if like he was getting cut. He was basically just, kind of summarizing where he's at now with the team and sort of, answering questions about playing on the scout team, not getting the starting job anymore. What do we think about his long-term value? He's not going to be on the Giants, but do you think he has a chance to, maybe sit for a season, play again at some point? I don't know what the market will be for him, given what the draft class looks like for the quarterbacks, but are you holding on to Daniel Jones in a 1-quarterback, 12-team dynasty league?
Well, no, not. I mean, in 1-quarterback 12 team, I mean, some of those he may not have even been rostered. The super flex, I think you definitely do. And I think like you can look at the top 12 quarterbacks right now this year and find a handful of guys who at least one team gave up on them. Like Baker Mayfield, we thought it was over at one point. Sam Darnold, we thought it was over at one point. Geno Smith, we thought it was over at 3 different points. Even Jared Goff, like the Rams were just throwing him into the deal because they wanted to go get Matthew Stafford.
Yep.
So I want to hold on to him. I'm not giving up on him. I think it'll be really interesting this offseason to see what does he value. Does he go somewhere like you've talked about the car wash, where a team that can turn him into a better quarterback if he sits for a year, or does he go somewhere and try to earn a starting job next year?
Here's a question. How many quarterback jobs are going to be open this offseason? Like I'm running through the teams right now, and I'm thinking there might be like six teams that are in the market for a new quarterback. Giants,
the ones that I think that are questionable
included.
or guaranteed. You got the Raiders.
Yep.
You have the Jets potentially. He's not going to the Giants, obviously. He's
No,
staying with the Giants.
I mean, that would be kind of ridiculous.
Titans
Titans might.
Titans almost certainly will. Panthers maybe.
Steelers. Do Steelers have a quarterback under contract for next year?
Steelers not have a quarterback under
They
contract.
don't, but they could theoretically re-sign one or both of the guys that they have now. But sure, they're in the market. Did you say New Orleans?
Nope, New Orleans is definitely in the conversation.
Okay.
You got to assume
there's
that
a handful of places. I would imagine that his goal is going to be to try and latch on with one of those places.
if I was Daniel Jones,
Yeah,
and Sam Darnold leaves the Vikings, that's the place I would go.
I don't know if they'd want him, but sure, that would be an excellent opportunity.
Play behind J.J. McCarthy, learn from Kevin O'Connell. You know that the standing for McCarthy right now not guaranteed because of his injuries.
Yeah. Sure. No, that makes sense. Any quarterback that goes to Minnesota is going to get attention, certainly in Superflex leagues, just in case McCarthy isn't ready to go. I would say his next best option is to go to a team that's got, kind of do what Carson Wentz did and go to a team that's going to be playoff bound, great coaching staff, and maybe they can help. That's the Baker Mayfield route, right? Isn't that what Baker ended up doing? Is he went to LA? It was only for like a third of the season that he was with the Rams and he played for the Rams. But that kind of jump-started his chance to, build himself back up. And the Bucs bought in, and lo and behold, here he was, a great NFL quarterback and a great fantasy quarterback again. So there will be options for him. I don't think he's going to be like kicked to the curb and, given the double bird from the rest of the league. But it's just a matter of, can he find a place where he can even potentially start at any point in the season?
All right, let's rip
Obviously,
through
if
some
he's
of
back
these.
anywhere that could happen, but he'd want to go somewhere where he could at least have a chance to start week one or get coached up by a really good coach that can help him bounce back in 2026.
All right, let's rip through some of these news and notes here. So Kyle Shanahan remains hopeful that Brock Purdy will play Sunday at Green Bay. He's dealing with the shoulder injury. Did throw a little bit more on Thursday than he did on Wednesday, but did not finish practice.
Right.
Just quickly, Heath, if we don't have Brock Purdy, and right now it could be Brandon Allen, maybe Josh Dobbs, but Brandon Allen right now is number 2 on the depth chart.
Yeah.
Do we downgrade everybody in San Francisco?
Yes. And my first instinct was a lot. And then I remembered, like, we had Nick Mullins throwing for 8 yards per attempt at one point in this offense. Like, I'm not sure, probably not as much as I was originally thinking. I'll probably move Debo and Juwan Jennings outside of my top 24 wide receivers, but they'll still be inside of my top 36. George Kittle still going to be a must-start tight end. Christian McCaffrey still going to be a must-start running back.
And we'll get into this game. We'll get into this game a little bit later. But
Okay. I've got Brandon Allen's career stats. I was going to ask Heath where these numbers rank compared to like an average quarterback, but we can do that later.
Yeah, save that for later. All right, running back news. We got Alexander Madison and Zamir White both not practicing again on Thursday. They did not practice on Wednesday. Amir Abdullah, 33% roster. Dave, if Abdullah is the starter for the Raiders against the Broncos, he is a what running back to you?
A good bye week running back and a desperation spot starter in half and full PPR. And I don't think he'll be the only guy there. There was a report in the Las Vegas Review-Journal that rookie Dylan Laube could get a good amount of work as well. We've talked about Laube this week about his only carry went for negative fantasy points because he fumbled. They have a practice squad running back named Sincere McCormick, who I need to learn about before I start thinking about how he could fit into the Raiders offense. But the reality is this is a Raiders offense that isn't very good against a Denver defense that's really good. And we could end up seeing this game get lopsided pretty quickly, much like the Broncos game did last week. And that could lead to Amir Abdullah logging a lot of snaps as the passing downs back, hurry up offense back, play from behind type back. And maybe he gets in the neighborhood of 4 or 5 catches along with 8 carries on top of it. You could do worse for a bye week running back.
So here's what, just in case you're looking at it from PPR, Denver has allowed 8 running backs to score at least 6.8 PPR points this season with just their receiving totals alone. So he would get the opportunity to play a lot on passing downs. Yep. And if that's where we're starting with, that puts him in a solid flex spot potential starting option if he's going to get around 6 PPR points with just his reception totals, because you can throw the ball out of the backfield against Denver.
How excited are you, Jamie, to have this guy back in fantasy?
I mean, between J.K. Dobbins and Amir Abdullah, it's like, my favorite season ever. Isaiah Pacheco was limited again on Thursday. Heath, just give us your take again. If Pacheco does play, the split between him and Kareem Hunt, and how would you like these guys?
Yeah, I've got Kareem Hunt as a high-end RB2 without Isaiah Pacheco. He's a low-end RB2 with Isaiah Pacheco. I would expect Kareem Hunt to touch the ball more than Isaiah Pacheco, or the same in Pacheco's first game back. I would expect Kareem Hunt to handle the short yardage work. And hopefully, I think the real key is that we need Samaje Perine to go away on passing downs. Because if Perine's handling passing downs and Pacheco and Hunt are chopping up the rushing downs, then we may not want to start anybody in this offense. But I would still favor Hunt in week 1, and I still don't really feel like Pacheco is going to play this week.
Yeah, we'll find out hopefully before Sunday, but we get that answer for you. If we don't get the answer for you, since we already did our mailbag, we'll get that to you on Sunday morning at 11:30 a.m. Eastern. DeAndre Swift, it was upgraded to limited practice on Thursday after not practicing on Wednesday. We'll talk about that game as they take on Minnesota. Josh Jacobs still limited in practice with the quadricep injury. We'll talk about that game as they take on San Francisco. You got 2 running backs in the concussion protocol. Tyjae Spears did not practice on Thursday. They get Houston this week, so that's good news for Tony Pollard in terms of his workload, tough matchup. And Justice Hill started the week in the concussion protocol, so maybe Keaton Mitchell gets a bigger role in the passing down situation as the number 2 guy there behind Derrick Henry as they take on the Chargers on Monday Night Football. Before we get to the wide receiver and tight end news, we'll take a quick break here on Fantasy Football Today, and then we're going to certainly get into a lot of the games with the NFC home games today. A lot of good games coming up on CBS on Sunday. Make sure you're checking it out. You can also stream the games on Paramount Plus. Wide receiver news and notes. Devontae Smith did not practice again on Thursday. We'll talk about that game as they take on the Rams this week. Could be good news for Dallas Goedert and hopefully a bounce back game for A.J. Brown. He's been struggling a little bit in his last 4 games. CeeDee Lamb was downgraded from limited practice on Wednesday to not practicing on Thursday. That's certainly an injury to monitor as they take on the Commanders. Brandon Cooks was limited Thursday as well. He's trying to make his return from IR. He's 16% rostered, so maybe if Lamb does not play, you're looking at Brandon Cooks in a desperate situation. Ladd McConkey started the week as limited. Hopefully he'll be okay Monday Night Football against the Ravens. Darius Slayton was a full participant in practice coming back from the concussion protocol. And Adam Thielen remained limited in practice on Thursday. He's 24% rostered. They take on Kansas City for this week. Tight ends, he said George Kittle will be downgraded if Brandon Allen starts, but that's good news that George Kittle will play because he still remains limited in practice on Thursday, but he is expected to go against the Packers. Jake Ferguson still in the concussion protocol. Luke Schoonmaker is 7% rostered as they take on the Commanders. We'll talk about that game. And Noah Fant was upgraded to limited practice on Thursday. He's missed the last 2 games with a groin injury. Maybe he does return against Arizona in week number 11. Some offensive line injury news to keep an eye on. Zach Martin and Tyler Smith both did not practice on Thursday for the Cowboys. Tristan Wirfs was limited for the Bucks. Teron Armstead, not a surprise, did not practice on Thursday. We'll keep an eye on his status for the Dolphins as they take on the Patriots. Ben Powers, the guard for the Broncos, was still limited in practice on Thursday. And Trent Williams did not practice on Thursday, but I'm sure it was more of a rest day for him as they take on the Packers this week. It could be really bad for San Francisco if they don't have Trent Williams or Brock Purdy. So keep an eye on that for the 49ers. Also, Nick Bosa dealing with an injury as well as we look at the defensive injuries. So Bosa did not practice on Thursday also. Joey Bosa, Khalil Mack, and Derwin James were all limited for the Chargers. Roquan Smith, we spent a lot of time talking about this, what the run defense looks like for the Ravens with or without Roquan. He did not practice as they have the Monday night game, so keep an eye on that heading into Saturday with the final injury report. Jair Alexander did not practice on Thursday, dealing with his knee injury. Jack Jones and Nate Hobbs did not practice for the Raiders. So that could
and Jacorian Bennett.
All 3 cornerbacks. You're right. 3 cornerbacks not practice for the Raiders. So that could be good news for Bo Nix and Cortland Sutton and maybe Devon Vele if you need a desperation flex option. He has 10 or more PPR points each of his last 2 games. Will Anderson was limited for the Texans. L'Jarius Sneed did not practice for the Titans. Calais Campbell's having a fantastic season for the Dolphins. He did not practice on Thursday. And Dexter Lawrence was limited for the Giants, but Kayvon Thibodeau did practice in full. Keep an eye on the Giants' defensive line injuries because that could actually be a sneaky DST based on the Bucs' offensive line, especially if Wirfs does not go. One kicker note to be up to date on is Austin Seibert again remained limited in practice on Thursday, dealing with the hip injury. So keep an eye on that because he has been a great fantasy kicker so far this season. All right, one question for each game. We got Tampa Bay and the Giants. Dave, I'll start with you. Mike Evans after a 3-game layoff or Malik Neighbors playing with Tommy DeVito? Who do you like better?
Evans, running right back into his arms, is a must-start number 1 fantasy wide receiver.
I'll give you my favorite stat of the game of the week. This is courtesy of Heath Cummings from our show on Wednesday. Mike Evans needs to average 95 yards per game over his final 7 games to get his 11th straight season of 1,000 yards receiving. His high so far this year in a game is 94 yards receiving. So he needs to not only have his best game of the season, every game on average for the rest of the year, but we know how these late season pushes have gone for him. So hopefully it starts.
I wouldn't bet against him.
Yeah, I would not bet against him either, especially without Chris Godwin. We'll talk about
where did the Giants rank in yards per game to wide receivers.
You can look that up when we get to the game. So let's go San Francisco and Green Bay. Heath, which Packers receiver do you trust the most? Christian Watson, Jaden Reed, Romeo Doubs, Dontavian Wicks.
I do not trust a Packers wide receiver, but Jaden Reed is the highest ranked. I think I have Reed, Watson, and Romeo Doubs all projected within 10 spots in my wide receiver rankings between wide receiver. They're all number 3 wide receivers. But Reed is a good number 3. Watson is a boom bust number 3, and Doubs is a bad number 3.
Looking forward to breaking down that game in a little bit, just based on how the San Francisco secondary will try and defend these guys. Dallas and Washington, Dave, can you trust both Commanders running backs? Brian Robinson Jr., he knows my starter of the week. Austin Eckler's been fantastic, really, with and without Robinson over the last month. But can you trust both of them taking on Dallas?
I think the only game script that goes against Robinson is if the Cowboys build a lead and the Commanders have to play from. I can't even finish the sentence. Now Brian Robinson's going to get a good amount of work. We can get into some of those stats that I love about Brian Robinson when we get to the game. But yes, start. And Eckler is in that number 3 running back, maybe low end number 2 running back in full PPR kind of canoe. Just the type of guy that you're hoping can get 4 catches, total 70 yards, something like that, and maybe get lucky and he scores.
I actually have Eckler ranked ahead of Chuba Hubbard, Tony Pollard, and DeAndre Swift as of now. So I like the setup for both Commanders running backs. Arizona and Seattle. Heath, who is the best pass catcher in this game, factoring in Trey McBride? You could throw in Noah Fant if you want to also, but the Cardinals tight end and both teams receivers. Who do you like the best?
I do not want to throw Noah Fant in. I will go with DK Metcalf, but I do have he and JSN pretty close. I think there's like 5 must-start pass catchers in this game, or at least 4. So, but yeah, it's DK.
I'm curious to get your take on Metcalf coming up later in the show, because the numbers against this defense are not good for him and not good for number 1 wide receivers lately. So the history is not good, but I'm a little nervous about DK after doing some research in this game. Minnesota and Chicago. Dave, are we ready to trust DJ Moore again after his best game since week 6 in the first game with Thomas Brown?
Adam pointed out to me last night that his ADOT last week was under 1 yard. So he got a lot of short screens. Bears did what I thought they were going to do, and that's simplify the offense for Caleb Williams. And if they do that again, yes, that would theoretically help DJ Moore as a number 3 receiver, particularly in full PPR. That's about as far as I'm willing to trust him.
All right, so we'll break down that game as well as the Bears and the Vikings meet each other for this big NFC North showdown. Last game here for our one question for every game. Heath, Cooper Kupp or Puka Nacua as the Eagles and Rams meet up?
I'm going to go with Puka Nacua. Again, you're probably starting both of them, but I do think that Puka, a little bit more ability to create explosive plays. Kupp is closer to him in full PPR because of the targets and the catches, but I'll take Puka.
It's a brutal matchup. So we'll see if these 2 stud receivers can come through. And I'm curious if anybody wants to post in the chat, and please hit the like button. We would appreciate it. Do you have both Rams receivers on any of your fantasy teams? I do in one 10-team league where we had some IR issues. I think there was maybe 1 IR spot per every team. And somebody dropped Cooper Kupp early in the season. And I had Puka Nacua in my 1 IR spot, so I picked him up. And so now I have to make that decision every week with Malik Neighbors and Devontae Adams. It's a 3-receiver league with a flex. So trying to decide if I want to play both Rams receivers every week has been fun. All right, let's get into the games here. We'll start with Tampa Bay and the Giants. The stat of the game here, we already went over it. I'll repeat it again. Mike Evans needs to average 95 yards per game in his final 7 games to reach 1,000 yards receiving for the 11th year in a row. As Heath said, don't bet against him based on how things have gone. So let's start with the Bucs. You got Baker Mayfield, only 2 games this season with fewer than 20 fantasy points. Only one of those was without Mike Evans on the field. That was week 3 against Denver. The Giants have allowed at least 23.8 fantasy points to 2 of the past 4 opposing quarterbacks. So is it just an easy Slam dunk, Baker Mayfield's back in your lineup, Dave?
I think so. Top 10 fantasy quarterback. Good when Evans was out. He should be good again with Evans back in. And I think the matchup is favorable as well. And Baker Mayfield is a must start. Here are some quarterbacks that I have ahead of him that you might, do a double take at. Bo Nix, Jared Goff, love Goff this week. Patrick Mahomes is ahead of him because he's taking on Carolina. Justin Herbert's ahead of him. But that's it. Guys like Jaden Daniels, Sam Darnold, Purdy, Tua, Love, all behind Baker Mayfield. Welcome back to the top 10, Baker.
I'm going to ask Keith this question. Dave, do me a favor. Look up what the weather's supposed to be in New Jersey this week. Heath, Adam brought up the Giants and their pressure rate and how they get to quarterbacks. And now Thibodeau is back along with hopefully a healthy Dexter Lawrence. No worse. Do we have any concern about Baker maybe being protected in this game?
Maybe a little bit, and maybe that makes me a little bit more nervous about Mike Evans because he doesn't generally handle the short area targets. If Baker has to get the ball out of his hand quicker, I think he will. It's just going to mean more targets for Cade Otton, more targets for Rachaad White, and maybe whoever's playing the slot this week for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. If it gives me concern about anybody, it would be Evans more so than Mayfield, but I'm starting both of them.
So just some numbers on Evans before Dave gives the weather report here. He's got 3 games this season with at least 23.1 PPR points, 4 games with 9.5 PPR points or less. He's only got 1 game with more than 7 targets, but we know that no Godwin. He has not played a game yet without Chris Godwin on the field. The Giants are 13 in fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers, so it's not the easiest of matchups. And you mentioned the slot receiver. I would hope it's going to be Jalen McMillan, or at least the second receiver. Whether it's going to line up in the slot or play outside, at least going to be the guy that's second in targets. Did not play in week 9 with a hamstring injury. No snaps in week 10. Did have a full practice after the bye, so should be healthy. But prior to the bye week, 2 games with at least 7 targets. One of those was the game where both guys got injured. That was against Baltimore, and then came back the next game. Now he had 8 targets against Baltimore, 7 targets the following week. So we'll see if he does have a bigger role. And then any concern with Cade Otton, because Mike Evans back, and the Giants are number 1 in fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing tight ends. Only 1 touchdown allowed to the position. Now they haven't exactly faced murderer's row. Zach Ertz twice, Jake Ferguson once when Dak was healthy, and Pat Freiermuth are the 3 best tight ends that they faced. But Otton now does have the target crunch potentially with Mike Evans back on the field.
I think he can still funk. I think, like you said, you hope Jalen McMillan's the number 2 wide receiver. I think Cade Otton's the number 2 wide receiver. So must start tight end. I think I've got him 4th or 5th. So I'd start Bowers, Kelsey, Kittle, and McBride over him. That's it.
I almost feel like he's the one who's replaced Chris Godwin, just that short area safety blankie for Baker Mayfield. So there's no way I'm getting away from Cade Otton at this point. There's just way too much upside with him. Weather, 53 degrees, overcast, winds 10 to 20 miles an hour. So maybe we do a check of the weather before the game and just to see how bad that wind is at MetLife Stadium. We know that it can get pretty bad there. I also wanted to point out that on the year, the Giants are giving up an average of 91.2 receiving yards per game just to outside wide receivers. So if Evans is going to get this number, we're looking for 95 yards this week for him to try and get that average to 1,000. He's going to need a lot of targets, and maybe he moves into the slot a little bit more than normal to try and take advantage of the matchup there.
All right, let's talk about the Bucs running backs here because I think a lot of people are interested in this matchup as well. The Giants have allowed at least 1 running back to score at least 13.1 PPR points in 7 games in a row. They haven't done it with both guys in the same backfield doing that, but I don't think a lot of teams have the combination that the Bucs have. Rachaad White scored at least 12.5 PPR points in 4 games in a row. He's got at least 5 catches in 3 of his last 4 games. And Bucky Irvin scored at least 15.4 PPR points in 4 of his last 5 games. And he's got at least 3 catches in 4 games in a row with 3 rushing touchdowns over that span. So, Heath, which of the Bucs running backs do you like better? And would you start both this week?
They're both low-end number 2 running backs for me. I've got Rachaad White, I think maybe a 1/10 of a point higher than Bucky Irving. Whoever scores the touchdown is the one that's going to be better. I do think that White's pass catching in full PPR makes him just a little bit better. But yeah, no problem starting both these. I don't think I've downgraded quite as many of the guys who are going to have 15 to 20 touches like the Tony Pollards as you have. So I don't have him quite as high, but I'd start him over like a DeAndre Swift.
Dave?
Giants are giving up 5.2 yards per carry. The Bucs talked about getting Bucky more work, and then Sean Tucker's name came up in Liam Cohen's.
No. Don't do that.
I'm thinking that maybe Sean Tucker gets a couple of carries and that's it. And then the rest of it goes with Bucky and Rashad White. We've seen Bucky just look better as a runner than Rashad White, but White has played more near the goal line, certainly can do a little bit more in the passing game. That's what his experience says. Bucky's caught some passes too. But I think that you could start either one of them as a low-end number 2 fantasy running back. I agree with Heath. I like Bucky better in non-PPR. I like Rashad White better in full PPR, but they're both back-to-back in that 22 to 24 range in my running back rankings.
Very positive schedule coming up for the Bucs. So hopefully this is the start of a strong finish for both of these guys. Or maybe if you just want to see one separate from the other, then you have to at least have one. You can get at least one running back that's a must-start guy and maybe one that's a flex. But for right
if you
now,
needed a quarterback, would you try and buy low on Baker in the next 48 hours because of that schedule?
You certainly can. I know how many people's trade deadlines have not passed yet, but
Right,
if you need a quarterback and the Baker manager found somebody to replace him last week when he was on a bye or had somebody already, then sure, that's a good option to go get. But I think a lot of people know getting Mike Evans back, the price tag has certainly gone up a little bit by comparison to the last couple of weeks. The Giants, there's really two must-start options or maybe start options, depending on how you view Tyrone Tracy, but Malik Neighbors and Tracy. In terms of Tommy DeVito, he started 6 games for the Giants last season and scored at least 17.5 fantasy points in 3 of them. So not a bad option in Superflex and 2 quarterback leagues. The Bucs are number 1 in most fantasy points allowed to the position. I went back through and looked at all of his games from last season, and Saquon Barkley was great in 2 of them, was good in another one. So had some mediocre performances there, but he did get Dallas when Dallas obviously was a great defense. He struggled against the Patriots. I think their run defense last year was still relatively good. He struggled a little bit against, I didn't put who they played in this game. Sorry. New Orleans. That was the last game against New Orleans. He struggled in that matchup. And the receivers, he had a couple of good games from Wan'Dale Robinson, a couple of good games from different outside receivers. So Jalen Hyatt had a good game. Darius Slayton had a couple of good games. Daniel Bellinger was the lead tight end at that point. He didn't really do very much, so I don't know if you're looking at Theo Johnson. So just in terms of the guys he was throwing to, it was kind of a mixed bag. He only had one game over 30 pass attempts in those 6 starts. So we'll see if maybe the volume ticks up a little bit here. And Dave has noted that this is a better offensive line that DeVito will play behind by comparison to last year, and certainly did not have a playmaker like Malik Neighbors in the passing game, but a little bit of a downgrade, obviously, from the running back perspective. So, Heath, what do you think about Tyrone Tracy this week? He scored at least 14 PPR points in 4 of 5 games this season where he's had double digits in carries. Tampa Bay is number 5 in most fantasy points allowed to the position.
He's a must-start running back with just this little hint of, I hope the bye week was long enough for everybody to forget about the fact that he dropped a pass that turned into an interception and fumbled the game away. Like he might be one mistake away from Devin Singletary playing a couple of series in a row, but fantastic matchup, been very efficient as a rusher. They probably want to run the ball a little bit more now that they've got DeVito playing quarterback. Should be a borderline top 12 guy. Just that little bit of risk in the back of my head.
And Barkley had in the 6 starts with DeVito, again, different player, but at least 3 catches in 3 of the 6 starts. So hopefully we see a little bit more work in the passing game for Tracy by comparison to what Daniel Jones was doing.
And I think one thing I think we should just bring up is you can't compare Tommy DeVito stats this year, even pass attempts per game, to Daniel Jones this year, because the Giants, Brian Daboll wasn't calling plays last year. The Giants were much, much, much more run heavy, no matter who was playing quarterback last year, than they have been this year. Jones is averaging 34 attempts per game. Last year, I'm not even sure he was averaging 30. So I think DeVito throws it more than he did in those games last year.
And 34 would be the season high for DeVito, or at least the games that he started. So that would be interesting to see if he is going to be consistently above 30 pass attempts. And again, if he keeps the job, Drew Lock was a little confused why he was not given the starting opportunity. So we'll see how things go for the Giants. Dave, give me your thoughts on sorry.
They just sent him a GIF of a tank when he asked why.
Right.
Just a tank in his
Dave, give me your thoughts on Malik Neighbors and Wan'Dale Robinson. Clearly more attention is going to be paid toward Neighbors. He hasn't scored a touchdown since week 3, and he's been 10.8 PPR points or less in 2 of his past 3 games. Are we sure that he's safe with DeVito?
I think he's safe as a number 2 receiver.
Dave, your volume is gone.
Yeah, Dave just disappeared. It's like the sun blots out his face, and now something's blotted out as Mike.
Try again, Dave.
You got me now.
No, why don't you log out and log back in and hopefully that fixes it. All right,
Okay.
Heath, give me your thoughts on Malik Neighbors and Wan'Dale Robinson. Robinson hasn't scored a touchdown since week 5 and 10.1 PPR points or less in 5 games in a row.
I'm viewing Malik Neighbors as a must-start top 12 wide receiver. Tommy DeVito could be so bad that I have to change that after this week. But when you compare DeVito last year to Jones last year, DeVito was more efficient as a passer. So I haven't downgraded Neighbors because of the quarterback change. I would view Wan'Dale Robinson as a number 3 wide receiver. He's going to be completely dependent on how much the Giants need to pass. Because I do think much lower intended air yards per attempt for DeVito last year. He does throw a lot of short area targets. That should be good for Wan'Dale Robinson. But if DeVito's throwing 28, 29 passes, that's not going to matter because Wan'Dale Robinson needs 9 or 10 targets to be good. Right around wide receiver 30 for me in full PPR. Much, much worse in half and none.
He's got 5 targets or less in 2 of his past 3 games. So we'll see what happens there. And then Theo Johnson was starting to make some plays prior to their bye week. 7.7 PPR points each of his 2 games against Washington and Carolina. And over that span, 7 catches, 88 yards, and a touchdown on 12 targets. Tampa Bay is number 5 in most fantasy points allowed to opposing tight ends. So for me, I looked at it this week. Schoonmaker as a good 1-week replacement. Jatavion Sanders, if you wanted a 1-week replacement and maybe something more just based on the matchups coming up. And then Theo Johnson was kind of the third desperation play at tight end. Maybe DeVito does give him some more opportunities to make plays as the Giants try to find out if Theo Johnson could be a playmaker for them going into 2025. All right, we take a quick break right now. We're going to get a lot faster on the games, but a lot more into the last 5 games that we're covering here. And hopefully Dave's mic is working here on Fantasy Football Today.
Yeah, wait a minute. Get it how you live it. 10 toes in when we standing on business.
A major prize at stake. The NWSL Championship, Saturday in primetime on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
Dave, you good?
You tell me.
No.
No.
What the hell? You can't hear me at all?
It's that's not great, but
Yep. Well, it's a good thing you it's a good thing you joined us today, Heath. All right, Dave, sign out.
Can you imagine, Jamie? Can you imagine if it was the one-man podcast for the rest of the Friday slate? That would have been really entertaining.
Yeah, it would have been good. We would have been really happy with Adam Azer. All right, stat of the game between the 49ers and the Packers. Christian McCaffrey hasn't scored a touchdown in the 2 games that he's played this season. The last time he went 2 games in a row without a touchdown was weeks 11 and 12 in 2022. So hopefully he finds the end zone this season. That was early in his tenure with the 49ers after the trade from Carolina. So we don't see this very often for Christian McCaffrey. Hopefully it's not 3 games in a row. We told you about Brock Purdy. Dave is going to hopefully come back and give us some Brandon Allen stats, but he's got 3 games in a row, at least 20.4 fantasy points. Heath, assuming he plays and he's fine, is he just a must-start quarterback against the Packers?
Yeah, I'm probably going to downgrade him a little bit if they tell us that he can't get through Friday's practice. Like if he really is not able to practice fully this week, then I think you have to view him as more of a low-end number 1. I can't imagine I'm going to get him outside of my top 12 because I don't really have 12 quarterbacks that I like. Right now, I've got Purdy 6th. The guys I have ahead of him are Lamar, Jalen, Jaden Daniels, Kyler Murray, and Baker Mayfield. I think you could consider Jordan Love over him. You could consider Patrick Mahomes or Bo Nix or Jared Goff. I'm probably not going to drop him much lower than that, but I will drop him a little bit if it's another partial practice. I kind of wonder if maybe we can have Debo stay a little closer to the line of scrimmage and do the things that he's good at instead of running 15 yards downfield and getting targets if Purdy's shoulder hurts.
All right, something to keep an eye on there, as well as Dave's microphone. So, Dave, can we hear you?
Can you hear me? Here
No.
we go.
Yeah.
You can't hear a word I'm saying?
We can, but
it's the quietest mic.
It's so faint. It's like you're whispering.
All right, 1 second.
All right, you keep working on it.
All right,
Christian
how about
McCaffrey.
now? Hello.
There he is.
And he turned his mic on.
Hey, I blame the entire solar system.
All right, Dave, you got those Brandon Allen stats?
Yes. So here's what we've got from Brandon Allen. This is career numbers. It's a 56.7% completion rate. Heath, you don't need to tell me that that's bad. 3.8% touchdown rate, 2.3% interception rate, 6.1 yards per attempt. I'm looking at the career touchdowns he's had. 3 of them have gone to tight ends, 1 to a running back. Everything else has been wide receivers, and typically it's been big wide receivers. T. Higgins, A.J. Green, Cortland Sutton, Tyler Boyd, Auden Tate. Remember Auden Tate? That dude was big. So that's the 30-second profile of Brandon Allen, and it makes me think that this isn't a good development whatsoever for anybody in San Francisco.
Yeah, I think you can add, like, I don't know if it's a 10% increase or a 20% increase or a 30% increase, but did you watch Jimmy Garoppolo on the Raiders? Did you watch Nick Mullins? Like, he did have a couple of good games last year, but when he was in Cleveland and played a game, it was absolutely awful. Like, there's a huge difference in playing in Shanahan's system and playing in anyone else's system.
It's a good point, but let's hope that Brock Purdy's out there. And so far, they're optimistic that he's going to play. And it would be very good for all the pass catchers involved. So let's talk about the three main pass catchers here: Juwan Jennings, Deebo Samuel, George Kittle. So Jennings has been awesome in the 2 games since he's returned. 17 catches, 184 yards, and a touchdown on 22 targets. At least 16.3 PPR points in each of those games against Tampa Bay and Seattle. Deebo struggled a little bit. 6.1 PPR points last week against the Seahawks. Only 1 receiving touchdown this season, which happened to be Week 6 against Seattle. But he has scored 12.6 PPR points in 2 of his last 3 games. And he does have 7 targets. He does have 7 targets or less in 6 games in a row, which isn't encouraging. George Kittle, just been a stud. Green Bay's number 11 in fantasy points allowed to tight ends. And he scored at least 14.5 PPR points in 6 games in a row with 7 touchdowns on the season. So, Dave, when you look at these 3 guys, are 2 of them easy and one's a little bit challenging with Deebo?
Well, I mean, it comes down to the quarterback first and foremost.
Let's assume Purdy's playing.
And assume that Purdy's okay. I mean, that's also part of the problem, is that if Purdy, he needs to get in like a full practice, and every report out of San Francisco says he looks fine, he's good to go. Like, that's what I need to hear to not be scared even a little bit about starting these guys. But Deebo has me scared. He has been putting up numbers like we're used to seeing. I know that like 12 PPR points, if that's the range that we're putting him in, then I want to rank him accordingly. That's a number 3 receiver. Juwan Jennings has been getting awesome targets, 11 each of his last 2 games. He's had at least 16 PPR points each of his last 2 games. I'm kind of starting to warm up to him as the type of wide receiver that can get me 15 PPR points and maybe even 9 points in a non-PPR league. And if Jair Alexander doesn't play and he's got a PCL injury right now, he might end up being Jennings. I mean, could end up being a top 12 type of fantasy wide receiver. It sounds silly, but he's just been balling out the last couple of weeks. And I'm kind of buying into him winning with physicality, making plays after the catch, not a burner, not anywhere close to the speed of Brandon Ayuk, but somebody who's getting relied on in this offense. George Kittle coming back obviously is a must-start tight end. That doesn't matter whether it's Allen or Purdy under center. But that's kind of how I view this passing game.
And no interest in Ricky Pearsall, obviously, just until we see a little bit more.
On the bench. Yeah, last week was a big letdown.
He was good against Tampa Bay. That was the concern. It was Tampa Bay. And no George Kittle last week. To see him not perform well was a little frustrating. For the Packers, you got Jordan Love. Heath, you touched on this a little bit in your Purdy ranking. Is he safe? Because he's got 3 games in a row without multiple passing touchdowns and 1 touchdown and 3 interceptions in his past 3 games. And that was against Jacksonville, Detroit, and Chicago. San Francisco's number 7 in fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks. But Nick Bosa may not play, dealing with the hip injury. So is Love just a set it and forget it quarterback, or would you play Bo Nix over him? Would you play Justin Herbert over him? Like, where are we at with Jordan Love right now?
I've got basically him and Mahomes and Nix. I mean, they're all ranked as top 10 quarterbacks. I'm probably just starting Jordan Love. But I think if you wanted to play Nix over him, especially in a 4-point per pass touchdown league, I could understand that. There's a little bit of context to the Jordan Love struggles, right? I mean, we had the injury and we had what's that?
The groin injury.
Right. And we had like Chicago. You talk about how good San Francisco is against quarterbacks. Chicago's been the best team against quarterbacks this year. So I still view him pretty much as a must-start quarterback, even in a bad matchup.
All right, so if Bosa is out, that will certainly help.
Yes.
Josh Jacobs, again, limited in practice with the quad injury. He scored at least 12 PPR points in 6 games in a row. No concern there. He's a low-end number 1, high-end number 2 running back for all of us this week. So let's talk about the receivers. So Dave, Heath said he doesn't trust any of them, and they're all number 3 receivers, which I think is the right route to take. You got Jaden Reed. He scored 9.8 PPR points or less in 3 of his last 4 games. 6 targets or less in 6 games in a row. Christian Watson had the big game last week, but he scored 10 or more. It's only the second time all season where he scored 10.3 PPR points or more and only has 2 touchdowns this season. Romeo Doubs has scored a combined 9.5 PPR points in his past 2 games, and that was against Detroit and Chicago. And then Dontavian Wicks has no catches in his last 2 games, so I don't think anybody's factoring him
No.
in. But the 3 other receivers, Reed, Watson, Dobbs, how do you feel about them against San Francisco, which is number 10 in fewest fantasy points allowed to the position?
Yeah, and to that point, just 5 wide receivers have 15 or more PPR points against the 49ers this entire season. 3 of the 5 have been in the past 6 games, and 2 of them have been slot players with volume. That's Jackson Smith and Jigba, that's CeeDee Lamb. So could this be a game where Jaden Reed gets a lot of volume and ends up being just as good as those types of receivers? I would bet against that. I don't think he'll get a lot of targets. I think the targets get spread around quite a bit. But I do think that if Bosa plays and if he's right, Jordan Love's got to get the ball out quick. That would help both Jaden Reed and Romeo Dobbs get some extra targets than they might normally. If Nick Bosa is out, then that I think kicks down the door for Christian Watson to get some deep targets again. Whether he can catch them all for 150 yards like he did last week against Chicago remains to be seen. But he would be like a boom bust type of number 3 receiver. There's a whole range of those guys. Still top 36, but not anywhere close to top 24 as it stands now. Reed is my highest ranked. He's a borderline number 2 wide receiver.
Packers receiver or Calvin Ridley?
Ridley.
Packers receiver or DJ Moore?
I have Reed ahead of Moore.
I do too.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think anybody else in that range. Jacoby Myers or a Packers receiver?
I'm almost positive that
Jacoby.
I've got Reed ahead of Myers.
Reed ahead of Myers. Okay. I have Ridley ahead of all of them. I have Myers ahead of all of them. And I think Reed ahead of DJ Moore as well. Tucker Kraft, no catches last week. Anybody have any interest in Tucker Kraft? 49ers number 6 and fewest fantasy points allowed to the position.
Tough to trust.
No. I mean, like I said earlier in the week, there were 3 streaming tight ends in my top 12 this week. It was a great week for adding a tight end off the waiver wire. There's no reason you should still have to start Tucker Kraft.
There isn't a tight end on the year that has more than 9.3 half PPR points against San Francisco. That includes Travis Kelce. That includes Jake Ferguson. This is an easy one, I think.
And Kate Otten, who was as hot as they can come, going into last week, only 8.5 PPR points or less for all 3 of those guys in the last 4 games. So they've been doing a great job against the position. All right, Dallas is at Washington. We can start with the Cowboys. There's really not much to say here because nobody's trusting Cooper Rush. He did have 18.4 fantasy points on 55 attempts against Washington. And we may see Trey Lance getting some playing time. So just keep that in mind for Superflex and 2 quarterback leagues. Rico Dowdle. So he's combined for 14 PPR points in his past 2 games. 5 catches for 9 yards on 8 targets in the starts with Cooper Rush, and both guards are hurt for Dallas. Is it just avoid him at all costs right now?
You would like to. I think anybody who's starting Rico Dowdle is doing so out of necessity, not out of want to. But there weren't any waiver wire running backs that I want to start over him. So, like, if you're in that stuck position, there's not somebody I could go find that I want to use.
So you'd start Rico over Abdullah if both Raiders are out?
I don't really have much confidence that Amir Abdullah is going to get double-digit rush attempts in a game.
That's fair. If we're going to go based on that, then sure, Dowdle would be the guy to go with. But I think the Commanders' defense smashes. This is Dan Quinn going up against his former team. We've seen this time and time again where when the defensive coordinator, the old defensive coordinator, comes back to take on his team, he crushes them. And now he's going to face them without their starting quarterback and potentially without 2 starting guards, one of them an all-timer in Zach Martin.
And their tight end.
Huh?
And their tight end.
And their tight end, yeah.
I don't want to start him. Like, I want to be clear. I'm not excited about him.
I get it. I do have Abdullah 1 notch ahead of Dowdle, but it's more because I really don't want to start Dowdle.
Yeah, I would start Abdullah just based on his hopeful role in the passing game because for whatever reason that's disappeared with Cooper Rush. You would think that would be something that they'd lean into a little bit more. So for me, I would go with Abdullah, but I think a lot of people probably share your sentiment, Heath, that, just it's one situation is bad, the other one's worse. And just, do you want to make a transaction if you don't have to? So Dave, to your point, Dan Quinn knowing this team, CeeDee Lamb is banged up, hopefully he's going to play, but he was downgraded from Wednesday to Thursday, which is never a good sign. We may see Trey Lance, which I don't think is going to help CeeDee Lamb. And look, he's been good in the 2 games without Cooper Rush. If he catches the touchdown in Dave's living room, or if he, just does what he did last week with 18.6 PPR points against the Texans. He's got 22 targets in the 2 games. He has a great history against Washington. He scored 5 touchdowns in his last 4 games against the Commanders and at least 15.3 PPR points in each of those games. But if they know him and they know the team and the quarterback's bad and the offensive line is bad, is it just easy to say CeeDee Lamb's a must-start receiver, or do we have some concerns?
There's concerns, but how far do you move CeeDee Lamb down, knowing that he can still get double-digit targets and still piece together close to 15 PPR points? I mean, do you move him down behind the likes of Quentin Johnson and Calvin Ridley? I think he's got a little bit more upside than that, at least in full PPR. Do you move him down behind Malik Neighbors and Josh Downs? Now you can make the case for that because those guys have the upside to be better than what CeeDee Lamb has been. So I think he's in that mid wide receiver 2 range.
I hope he's okay.
Top 12.
I hope he's okay. So just keep an eye on the back injury. So like we said a couple times, do they risk him playing at less than 100%? He's going to be a good soldier and go out there and do what he can to support his team. We saw that with the shoulder injury that he suffered in the game that Dak got hurt and he still played. But, being downgraded during the week, that's a little concerning. If he does miss, any interest in Jalen Tolbert, Turpin, or Cook if he plays, or it's just I'm avoiding all Cowboys no matter what in the receiving corps?
It's too risky for me. You know who I wouldn't mind, though, if I'm looking for a cheap 10 PPR points is Schoonmaker. I think he can get you 10.
I'm starting Schoonmaker as a top 12 guy with or without Lamb.
So 6 catches, 56 yards. It's just 56 yards on 10 targets last week for him. That was after Ferguson got hurt. Just make sure Ferguson is out before we, start Schoonmaker. He is in the concussion protocol, but does not seem like he's going to clear since he was put in the concussion protocol on a Monday night game. All right, for the Commanders, this is a bounce back spot for Jayden Daniels, 15.4 fantasy points in each of his last 2 games. Not playing to the level that we know for Jayden Daniels. Only 23 rushing yards in his last 2 games. But Dallas is number 6 in most fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks. 4 of the last 5 have scored at least 24 points. And Jalen Hurts and Brock Purdy each ran for at least 56 yards and a touchdown against Dallas in the last 4 games. So is this a easy smash spot for Jayden Daniels?
They might score 50. You've got division rival that has beat up on you for decades. You've got Dan Quinn revenge game. We've got all the narratives for them to just go put up a huge, and the Cowboys are terrible defensively. So yeah, I'm starting all the Commanders. Start Daniels, start both running backs, start Terry McLaurin, start Zach Ertz.
All right, so Dave, you're going to give us some fun Brian Robinson stats, but just stay on Terry McLaurin for a second, Heath, because it's been an interesting ride for him the last couple of weeks because the targets have been somewhat down. He was productive 2 games ago, but last week he was miserable, clearly, with the matchup against Philly with 1 catch for 10 yards. You going right back to him? No issues?
I'm going right back to him. He's a number 2. He's not a number 1 for me, but I'm going right back to Terry McLaurin. I think, and he might just be one of those guys that, yes, that there's a really low floor on a weekly basis because they might go score 50 and just score 7 rushing touchdowns. But he's got the upside to score 25 points any week, and I'm just not going to sit that guy.
Noah Brown's got 6 targets, at least 6 targets in 3 of his last 4 games, and Zach Ertz is coming off a pretty impressive stretch. We know what he did in his revenge game last week against Philadelphia, 6 catches, 47 yards, and a touchdown. And that's now 14 PPR points in 3 of his last 5 games. So is Ertz a must-start tight end, Heath?
Top 10. I was talking about being pretty excited about streaming Luke Schoonmaker. I would not stream him over Zach Ertz. So I'd start Ertz over Mark Andrews. I'd start Ertz over Dallas Goedert. I'd start Ertz over TJ Hawkinson.
What about Disley and Jonnu Smith?
I have Jonnu and Disley ahead of Ertz.
Okay, so I do as well. I think it's interesting to see how those guys are performing, but Ertz can obviously have a big game here. All right, Dave. So Brian Robinson Jr. is the start of the week. Austin Eckler is coming off an impressive stretch, 17.3 PPR points in 3 games in a row. He's got 8 games this season with 10.2 PPR points. Give us your breakdown of the Commanders' backfield.
Well, first of all, I think Brian Robinson, fantasy-wise, he's never had a great game against Dallas, but I think he may know that, and he'll be ready to go and attack them and finally have a big game against America's team. He has 16 or more carries in 5 of his past 7 games. The 2 games he didn't do it in, one was a colossal blowout. He had 13.1 fantasy points, didn't catch any balls in that game. And the other one he left early. So I think he consistently gets north of 15 carries week after week. He scored in 6 of 8 games this year, and Dallas's run defense has allowed at least 18 PPR points to a running back in 4 of their past 5 games. Saquon Barkley somehow, some way, was limited by the Cowboys in Week 10. 4.8 yards per carry to running backs in those 5, 4.6 on the season. No matter how you slice it, this is not a good run defense, and Brian Robinson should get the opportunity to have a big game. I really like this start of the week. I think he is a number 1 fantasy running back, a top 12 guy for week number 12.
I think I'm the low guy on Robinson. I still have him ranked as a starter, but I should probably at least explain it. It's really simple. Adam said it on yesterday's show. He has 2 targets in his last 4 games. Like he has to score a rushing touchdown, or it's hard to have a great day. He'll probably score a rushing touchdown.
That's what I'm hoping for, and I wouldn't be surprised, to your blowout theory that he scores a couple times, in this game. And if you are desperate, we've seen in a couple of the Commanders' blowouts this season, Jeremy McNichols, may get some.
I'm starting him in a league.
Some fourth quarter run, just again, 6 teams on a bye, so we'll see how things go there. But hopefully Brian Robinson Jr. and Austin Eckler, again, a lot of work in the passing game for him last week against Philadelphia that boosted his stat line, but the 2 games prior was without Robinson. So I don't mind Eckler as a flex. The Cowboys have shown that they can give up some receptions to running backs this season. All right, next game, we got Arizona at Seattle. Stat of the game for this is 7 opposing number 1 receivers in a row against the Seahawks have scored at least 16.5 PPR points, including 4 scoring at least 20.7 points. That is a Marvin Harrison Jr. stat. Hopefully that continues. Now, they are getting healthy in the secondary for Seattle, but number 1 receivers lately have crushed the Seahawks defense, and hopefully Marvin Harrison comes through. So we'll start with the Cardinals in their passing game. Kyler Murray, easy start. I don't think anybody's concerned about this matchup, correct?
Correct.
He's averaged 24 fantasy points per game in his last 6 games against Seattle. James Conner, well, we'll talk about the running games in a second. Harrison, are we confident in Marvin Harrison Jr.? Is this going to be a big game for him? Is he going to live up to that stat and keep that streak going for 8 games in a row?
I'll say yeah. I've got him. I don't have him ranked as a top 12 receiver. And if you're going to score over 16 PPR points, that is top 12 receiver range. But he's just outside. Let's call him a top 18 fantasy wide receiver, maybe even top 15, because I think that the Cardinals can come out of the bye and continue to reshape how they use him. That's the thing that we complained about the most with Marvin Harrison at the beginning of the year was too many downfield targets, not enough short area targets, too many downfield routes, vertical routes, not enough horizontal routes. They've started to use him a little bit more, in breaking, out breaking routes. And I think that can make a big difference for his target volume and his production. And that's his best way of separating. He doesn't separate with speed. He's not like Malik Neighbors in that regard. He's an outstanding route runner and polished on top of it. They should be using him that way and giving him more targets on top of it against the Seahawks. I don't know if there's a defender who can keep up with him. Woolen, Witherspoon, they're good, but I think he can break away from those guys and have himself a pretty good game. I'm willing to take the chance on it.
I just wish there was like some sort of trend. Like I know they have been using him on those routes more recently. His recent game log is just a sporadic mess.
Yes.
Like just look at his yardage in his last 5 games, and it's 0, 21, 111, 34, 54.
So how do you make sense of it?
I've got in the projections, he's a number 3 wide receiver. I pushed him up in the rankings to be a number 2 wide receiver. I don't think I want to sit the upside because the upside is huge and it's a good matchup. But it's not like we've started to change the way they're using him, and so we're starting to see some consistency in his production. He's got 5 targets in each of his last 2 games.
And yet he still has over 16 PPR points in one of those 2. I think when you look at his game log, if he doesn't score, he stinks. And we've seen it. He has 2 games this year with over 100 yards, and he scored in both those games. But I don't think you're looking for 100 yards here. I think you're looking for an uptick in targets, and I think you're looking for a touchdown. And I think both those things can happen against Seattle.
All right, I think I know the answer to this. Marvin Harrison Jr. or CeeDee Lamb? Dave, you go
Marvin.
And I'd go Lamb.
And you go Lamb. That's what I thought.
Yeah. Marvin's 2 highest target games of the season are week 2 and week 3.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's been at 7 targets or less in 7 games in a row. So it's not like we're getting a huge volume of targets. And you said it. He did have 5 targets. Remember, that was the number going into last week's game. Last game for him was he needed 6+ targets to be successful. And he said, "Oh, he broke the streak." He got 5 targets and had a big game. So we'll see what happens moving forward there with him. Michael Wilson, if you're desperate, 26% rostered. He has not had a good stretch of games, but his last road game, he did have 14.1 PPR points. Again, receivers have had some success against this team. And then Trey McBride, he's got no receiving touchdowns yet this season, which is frustrating. He scored at least 11.1 PPR points in 3 games in a row. I don't think anybody has a decision of we're not playing Disley or Jonnu or Schoonmaker over Trey McBride. I don't think that matters to anybody, but hopefully this is a breakout spot for him. Past 5 games, Seattle has allowed George Kittle in week 6, Kyle Pitts in week 7, and Dalton Kincaid in week 8 to go 13.1 PPR points or more. Kittle missed the rematch last week, as we're aware, and the game in between the other bye week also during this stretch of 6 weeks was the Rams game where Davis Allen did not do very much. Cody Parkinson did not do very much. So tight ends have had some success against this defense. They are getting Jenkins back in their secondary, so we'll see if that matters. But hopefully this is a blow-up spot for Trey McBride. And then James Conner, any reservations? I mean, Seattle has been somewhat okay against the run recently, but Conner, I like what I saw in week 10 when he had 5 catches for 80 yards. Hopefully that's something that we see a little bit more of. Is Conner an easy just set it and forget it this week?
Must start.
I think he is. 14.6 or more PPR points to 3 of the last 4 running backs that Seattle's taken on. 13 plus to 6 running backs in their past 7 games. The Niners running backs combined for 28 non-PPR points against them way back when. I don't think this is a great run defense at all.
All right, let's go to the Seattle side of things. Anybody want to start Geno Smith?
No, he's a QB2. Start him
He's
into
a bye
the
week,
QB.
he's a bye week QB.
So his last 2 games against Seattle last year, against Arizona, 17.8 fantasy points, 24.4. He scored 15.7 points or less in 3 of his last 4 games. And here's what Arizona has done against quarterbacks recently. We know some of these guys have been hot at times, certainly lately, in terms of Justin Herbert and Tua Tagovailoa, but they faced Herbert, Tua, Caleb Williams, and Aaron Rodgers, and all 4 of those guys have scored 16.7 fantasy points or less. I don't want to trust Geno Smith against this team. It just feels like it's going to be tough. We'll talk about the passing game now, the receivers. So you got DK Metcalf and Jackson Smith in the Jigbus. Both guys, I think, are going to be ranked as starters. I know they are for me. I'm assuming for both you guys as well.
Yes.
So Metcalf, 14 PPR points last week in his first game back from the 2-game absence with a knee injury. Here's what number 1 receivers have done against Arizona the last 3 games. Obviously, the quarterbacks have not done well. The wide receivers have struggled also. Tyreek Hill has the best game, 13.2 PPR points. DJ Moore, 7.3 points. Garrett Wilson and Devontae Adams, both exactly 9.1 PPR points. And no receiver has scored a touchdown against this defense in 4 games in a row. That's the Chargers, the Dolphins, the Bears, and the Jets. Here's what makes me a little bit skittish about DK Metcalf. Last 5 games against Arizona overall. So this is going back over 2+ seasons. 17 catches, 170 yards, and a touchdown combined in those 5 games. Only 1 game over 11 PPR points. They seem to have his number. Is it safe to start DK Metcalf?
I'm still starting him, and I do think it's worth noting, like, he's played 1 game against this defense with this defensive coordinator. So it was it was some of the same guys 2 and 3 years ago, but it wasn't the same system. They hired their defensive coordinator at the beginning of last year. So I just can't, Arizona's defense has been really good as of late. And if you look at the last 4 games, they look like, man, how is anybody going to be good against them? And if you look one more game, the Packers wide receivers had 4 touchdowns, and 4 different guys scored 15 fantasy points. So I'm a little bit nervous about DK and JSN, but there's 6 teams on a bye. Half the good wide receivers in the NFL are hurt. They're both must starts for me.
And for JSN, just good numbers on JSN. 17 catches, 290 yards, and 2 touchdowns on 24 targets in his last 2 games. His last 3 games, at least 12.9 PPR points or more. So he's just on fire right now. And he did score 16.3 PPR points against the Cardinals in Seattle last year, if that matters to you. So against this defense, Heath clearly was a different player for JSN as well. I agree with you. Difficult to bench them, but Josh Downs or a Seattle receiver, Dave?
I've got Metcalf over Downs. I believe I have Downs over JSN.
Okay. I've got both Seahawks.
And the game where JSN it was like 4 for 63 and a touchdown against Arizona. DK didn't play. That was last year.
That's why DK's only played 1 game against this. Yeah, he did miss a game against them.
Sure. So what I see with this Cardinals defense is a lot of zone coverage. They don't blitz a lot. Their pass rush really hasn't been that good. They addressed it in the trade with Denver to get Baron Browning, and they're getting their first-round rookie back, Darius Robinson. Whatever good they can bring will help this defense a lot. And Geno isn't as good when he's pressured. He's definitely more aggressive against man coverage than zone coverage. So he's going to need volume. He's got good volume. It's one of the reasons why I'm okay with JSN and DK. It feels like the targets have been concentrated to those 2 guys over the last week, obviously, but I don't know if we can really say 3 or 4 weeks, but we haven't seen Lockett in a big role lately. And so I'm thinking / hoping that it's a lot of targets to Metcalf, a lot of targets to JSN, and those two guys kind of just bit by bit put it together to give you at least 15 PPR points each. I don't know if I love them as much in non-PPR because I don't know how many big plays they're going to have against this defense.
And Tyler Lockett does have a good history against Arizona. 18 catches, 291 yards, and 4 touchdowns with 3 games of at least 15.1 PPR points in his last 5, but nobody's trusting him. He's got 4 targets or less in 3 games in a row. You're not going to start a Seattle tight end. Just keep an eye on if in a desperate, tight end premium league. AJ Barner, the last 2 games without Fant, has gotten you 6 catches, 42 yards. But Fant, if he does return, had scored at least 10.5 PPR points in 2 of 3 games prior to the injury. All right, we're going to take one final break. Our producer, Claire, is going to kill me because we're already over an hour. Adam's going to murder me when he finds out what the timestamp's going to be for this. But we got 2 more games to go here on F15.
CBS Sports HQ, giving you CBS Sports HQ, giving you college football coverage unlike anyone else.
We're talking Big Ten.
Pre- and post-game coverage.
Are you encouraged with the way that this team responded?
Along with breaking news.
A lot of movement in the rankings this week.
Highlights and expert analysis.
That streak could be in jeopardy here.
Sure. What was your main takeaway from this game? How impressive was his domination?
That really changed the football game.
Let's go ahead and have some more fun.
Another wild ending.
The chaos continues.
Turn to CBS Sports HQ.
All right, last 2 games, we're going to knock these out in less than 10 minutes. So we got the Vikings and the Bears. The stat of the game, did I do one? I must have forgot it. I didn't do a stat of the game for this one. All right, so the Vikings, we got Sam Darnold here. So Dave and I had a good discussion on Sam Darnold. Heath, I'll let you break the tie. So Dave likes Sam Darnold this week, taking on the Bears, who are number 1 in fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks. He has been very good lately, scored at least 22 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games. But here's what the Bears have done so far this season. Trevor Lawrence in week 6 is the lone quarterback with multiple touchdowns against the Bears. And Lawrence, Jane Daniels, and Jordan Love, the only 3 quarterbacks to go over 20 fantasy points against this defense. So are you pro Sam Darnold or anti Sam Darnold in week number 12?
I view him kind of like Geno Smith, a high-end QB2 that I really don't want to start. But there's 6 teams on a bye, so I might have to. Listen, Jordan Love just barely got by the skin of his teeth with a rushing touchdown to get 20 fantasy points against this defense last week, and I think he was a 3rd quarterback all season to do it. So it is the worst matchup for opposing quarterbacks. I would like to sit Sam Darnold. I would rather start Bo Nix. I'd rather start Anthony Richardson.
I'm not there yet with Richardson. I'm definitely there with Bo Nix. I'd start Nix over Darnold, and he's a low-end starter for me. And it's been a little weird with this Bears defense because, they took on Kyler Murray. James Conner had a monster game. Kyler Murray didn't have to do anything to throw against the Chicago defense.
But 5 fantasy points, though. That's not having to do anything.
That's pretty terrible. But that situation, I suppose, is possible. Like the Bears' run defense isn't that good. If Aaron Jones can bounce back from what he's been over the last month, then yeah, Aaron Jones could have a monster game, and Sam Darnold doesn't do a lot in the game, and he gives you single-digit fantasy points. Last week, Jordan Love got you over 20 fantasy points. He also attempted just 17 passes in the game. So there haven't been a lot of it. Or maybe the better question to ask you guys is, have there been examples of quarterbacks with 30-plus pass attempts against Chicago that have had the opportunity to put up big numbers and just didn't because they turned the ball over a lot or they had a lot of
Stroud CJ Stroud threw 36 passes and scored 16 fantasy points.
Mm-hmm.
Trevor Lawrence.
Was that the game Nico got hurt in, or was it a week?
No, he got hurt against Buffalo.
Okay, so that's a good example. CJ Stroud went in there against Chicago. It was a home game. I remember that. I know I believe Mixon's the one who got hurt in that game. It's all coming back to me. But that's a good example of a quarterback who we had high expectations for, who had a lot of opportunities to put up numbers and then didn't against the Chicago Bears defense. I think Darnold's been playing well enough to warrant use as a top 12 quarterback, 22 or more fantasy points in 3 of his past 4 games. He's the number 9 quarterback in fantasy points per game on the year. He's also attempted at least 32 pass attempts in each of his past 3 games. That's been in line with Aaron Jones kind of seeing this downslide in efficiency. And you know how good his pass catchers are. You saw that Jordan Love was beating up Chicago on deep balls last week. Call him lucky, call him fortuitous. That is definitely something that is in Sam Darnold's bag. I said it on HQ. I'll say it again. If you think Aaron Jones bounces back, then don't trust Sam Darnold. But I think Darnold's got a little bit more upside than a lot of other quarterbacks that are in that 12 to 16 range that you talked about, Heath. And so I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt in a tough matchup, sure. But he's got a good offensive line protecting him, and he's played well. I think he deserves credit.
He did have over 30 pass attempts 2 games ago against Jacksonville and had a miserable day as well there. And that's certainly not a caliber of defense comparatively to Chicago.
That's absolutely true.
So he could have a lot of volume and still be Sam Darnold. I just don't want to trust him given the track record of Chicago's defense so far against opposing quarterbacks. You're starting Justin Jefferson. Doesn't matter what I tell you about the stats. Chicago's number 1 in fewest fantasy points allowed to receivers. Nobody cares. Jordan Addison and TJ Hawkinson, though. Let's talk about those two guys because Addison did tie a season high in targets last week with 8. Did leave in the fourth quarter with cramping, but he does have 15.1 PPR points in 2 of his past 3 games. And last year against Chicago, he did score in one of those matchups. So is Jordan Addison in the streaming or starting conversation in 3 receiver leagues?
Streaming / starting in a 3 wide receiver league. Yeah, he's a low end, right in that Romeo Dobbs range of a low end number 3 wide receiver that, you know what, if he goes out and catches 5 passes for 60 yards and scores a touchdown, nobody's really going to be that surprised by it. We're not going to be that surprised also if he has 5 fantasy points.
Dave, how do you feel about TJ Hawkinson? Because one great game in the 3 that he's played, the one great game was against Jacksonville. Ironically enough, the game that Sam Darnold struggled since Hawkinson has returned. Chicago has allowed 1 touchdown to a tight end so far this season. That was Chigo Okonkwo in week 1.
Hold on. Trey McBride ran for a touchdown against Chicago. So that's 2. That doesn't count. That's not. I don't think TJ Hawkinson is running for a touchdown. But if I like Darnold, I think I do have to at least like Hawkinson. I don't have to love Addison either way, although Addison does have boom bust upside. But I think that Hawkinson does get a little bit more of an opportunity this week than he did last week. Certainly can see him lining up against Chicago's linebackers and making some plays. Chicago's been playing with a backup safety. Maybe he lines up against him for a couple of plays. And I don't think this is going to be a blowout for Minnesota. I think that they're actually going to get a fight from Chicago, kind of like Green Bay did last week. And that's going to lead to volume and Darnold having to throw the ball at least 32 times, like we've talked about, just like he has in the last few weeks. And I think Hawkinson sees a decent target share. So I do like him as a top.
Heath, give me your take on Aaron Jones because it's been rough. 12.2 PPR points or less in 4 games in a row, but he hasn't scored a touchdown since week 7. The last couple of games have been miserable. He had the rib injury against Jacksonville in week 10. And then last week against the Titans, it was just awful, 5.3 PPR points. And that coincides with, I don't know if wanting to get Cam Akers more work, Jones being hurt, Jones struggling, but Cam Akers does have at least 12 total touches in each of his last 2 games, and he caught a touchdown against Tennessee. So is Aaron Jones still a safe number 2 running back?
He's a number 2 running back. I think he's more of a low-end number 2 running back. It's a much better matchup for running backs than it is for quarterbacks. And so I've got him, I think, at RB 19. There are guys like and I don't really have there are guys that I've had the urge to do what you've done and move them down even further, like behind Austin Eckler. I've not really had that urge with Aaron Jones because the matchup is so good. If he's not good in this game, then I'm not sure I'm going to feel good about starting him the rest of the year.
Yeah,
so I watched this film last week and he looks fine. Like when you watch him run, there's a night and day difference between him and Cam Akers in terms of explosiveness and cutting and all that stuff. But for whatever reason, the Vikings were rotating series, especially in the second half, where just if it's your series, Aaron Jones, you're in. If it's third down, whatever, you're in. I shouldn't say third down because there were a bunch of third downs where CJ Ham was in to pass protect. But the reason why Akers scored last week, it wasn't because they used him at the goal line. That was Cam Akers' drive, where he basically played the entire drive for Minnesota. So if they're rotating backs and they continue to do it this week, that hurts the upside of Aaron Jones even more. So I've slowly moved him up actually in my rankings, and I'm not sure if I'm going to keep him as high as I have him. I think he's like around 16th for me. He looks good, but I just don't know. I don't know if he's going to get a ton of opportunities, especially if Cam Akers is going to continue to rotate drives with him.
He does have a great history against the Bears. That's all with Green Bay. Last 5 games, 60 carries, 345 yards, 3 touchdowns, 18 catches, 208 yards, 3 touchdowns. So he's beat them up quite a bit in his career, and we'll see if he can do something similar this week. All right, we'll do the Bears quickly, and then Dave's got to bounce. Then we'll finish up with the last game. DeAndre Swift, because nobody's starting Caleb Williams. Just too tough to trust. He did have 70 yards rushing the first game with Thomas Brown, but he hasn't scored a touchdown since week 6. So let's see another productive game for him, but don't love it this week. DeAndre Swift is dealing with the groin injury, was limited in practice on Thursday. He scored at least 14.2 PPR points in 6 of his last 7 games. But Minnesota's number 2 in fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. Only 4 running backs have scored more than 10 PPR points against Minnesota this season. Is DeAndre Swift a safe number 2 running back this week?
I don't think he is. I like how the Vikings run defense played each of their last 3. And DeAndre Swift was saved by that long touchdown run last week against Green Bay. And if there's a groin injury on top of it, that's been limiting him in practice. Makes me nervous. I wonder how much he'll play. Could he rotate drives with Roschon? So low end number 2 running back at best.
Roschon's 57% roster. Just keep an eye on the injury report for DeAndre Swift. If he somehow is downgraded and misses practice on Friday or they rule him out, Roschon would be at least a flex option. Did have 10 carries, 33 yards, and a touchdown last week against the Packers. Heath, give me your take on the Bears receivers. Again, DJ Moore, 13.7 PPR points. Best game for him since week 6. Rome Odunze got at least 6 targets in 4 games in a row. He had a good game with Thomas Brown, 6 for 65 on 10 targets. And Keenan Allen's got 31 targets in his last 4 games, but has been absolutely miserable. Only 1 game with double digits in PPR points this season.
Since their bye week, DJ Moore is 3rd on the team in targets. Last week, first game with a new offensive coordinator, DJ Moore was 3rd on the team in targets. Rome Odunze has been the best Bears wide receiver since week 8. Last week, Rome Odunze was the best Bears wide receiver. I think Rome Odunze might be the best Bears wide receiver, and that's the way I'm ranking it this week. He and DJ Moore are both number 3 wide receivers. Keenan Allen should be. He's really testing the limits of how many targets a wide receiver can see and not be good in fantasy. It's incredible, but you can't start him.
Dave, final word?
Final word is Moore and Odunze are number 3 wide receivers, and Keenan Allen in non-PPR leagues, I think you can cut him. And in full PPR leagues, he's a good bench receiver and a good bye week guy. I had an awesome time hanging with you on the show today. Appreciate you're doing and good for 12.
There you go. All right, last game, Heath. Let's fly through this quickly. Eagles and Rams. Stat of the game. Philadelphia's allowed only 1 touchdown to a wide receiver since week 4. That's a span of 6 games, including matchups with the Browns. That was with Deshaun Watson. The Giants, so Malik Neighbors. Jamar Chase did have the good game against them. Jacksonville with a healthy Trevor Lawrence. Dallas with a healthy Dak Prescott. And Washington last week with Jane Daniels. So Jamar Chase, the only wide receiver to score double digits in PPR points against the Eagles in their last 6 games. Are we sure that it's safe to start Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua?
We're not, but there's 6 teams on a bye, and half the good wide receivers in the NFL are hurt, and I'm starting both Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. I'm just going to start them. I would feel like an idiot moron if I sat one of them and they scored 20 fantasy points. And they might.
But not an easy matchup by any stretch. All right, so we're starting Jalen Hurts. I'm just going to fly through the must-start guys. You're starting Jalen Hurts. You're starting Saquon Barkley. You're starting A.J. Brown. Hopefully, Brown may benefit if Devontae Smith does not play. He missed practice on Wednesday and Thursday with a hamstring injury. But what we've seen from A.J. Brown is he's not scored a touchdown since week 7, and it's been basically a miserable stretch of games for him based on the expectations. 15.9 PPR points against Dallas, but 13.4 against the Bengals, 5.6 against Jacksonville. He left that game, and 11.5 PPR points last week against Washington. So hopefully this is a bounce back spot for him. If Devontae Smith does not play, how much more do we like Dallas Goedert?
I would move him up. So I've got him behind 3 streamers right now. I would definitely move him ahead of Luke Schoonmaker. I'd probably move him ahead of Zach Ertz. I think I'd move him ahead of Will Dissly. I think he'd be a top 8 tight end for me if there was no Devontae Smith.
And look, for what it's worth, Goddard, now he's benefited with A.J. Brown missing time. He's benefited with Devontae Smith banged up a little bit. He scored at least 10.5 PPR points in 4 healthy games in a row. Now, he missed a stretch of time during that game. He's missed a stretch of games during that time as well. But he has been productive, did have 5 catches, 61 yards on 5 targets last week against Washington. So he's giving you a decent floor, and maybe the ceiling, ticks up a little bit. If Devontae Smith does play, knowing that he's banged up, knowing that he struggled the last 2 games, would you even consider starting him?
I think you have to consider it. He is right in the Christian Watson, Quentin Johnston, Romeo Dobbs range for me. A very low-end number 3 or a high-end flex. In this offense, with as efficient as they have been throwing the ball, like at any moment he could have a 40-yard receiving touchdown. So he's definitely in consideration, but he's not. You can't feel any security about it at all.
Last 2 games, again, 6 catches, 43 yards, no touchdowns, only 9 targets. So maybe this hamstring injury is bothering him, and you know that the Eagles are looking like a strong playoff contender. They may want to rest him to make sure he's ready for the stretch run. So just something to keep an eye on there. We'll find out what the Friday practice report is. Check out cbssports.com for the latest update. All right, so Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, they're must-start receivers. They've been awesome since coming back. The only game where Puka was bad was when he threw a punch. But again, difficult matchup against a very good Eagles secondary. Matthew Stafford, however. So this is one of those situations that I'm going to guess we're probably on the same page here. We like the receivers. We don't like the quarterback. So Stafford has played well. He does have 21.9 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games. And he did have 35.8 points last week against New England. He was a monster against the Patriots. But the Eagles, number 5 in fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks. So just easy sit him. Only start him in Superflex 2 quarterback leagues.
Yeah, absolutely. Easy sit.
And then let's just wrap up here with Kyren Williams, because similar to Aaron Jones, he's in a slump. 11.2 PPR points or less in 3 games in a row. And this is a very difficult matchup. The Eagles are number 6 in fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. Just 3 touchdowns to running backs all season. Now, Williams did not have a target against the Patriots. Prior to that, he caught 5 passes for 20 yards on 6 targets against Miami. He also caught 5 passes for 19 yards and a touchdown, 7 targets against Minnesota. That was a tough matchup as well in Week 8. How much does his work in the passing game matter to you to trust him this week against this defense?
Yeah, I mean, it is a terrible matchup, and he's not been good lately, but I'm just kind of viewing him like Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. I'm going to start Kyren Williams. He's a top 12 running back. I think the touchdowns will come back at some point. He had 6 touchdowns in a 4-week stretch, and now he's had 0 in a 4-week stretch. I still think he's a very good candidate to score a rushing touchdown. If he gets the work in the passing game, he's got a good chance to be a top 5 running back. And it was like he had 5 catches 2 weeks ago. He had 5 catches 4 weeks ago. He has 2 other games this season with 4 catches. So it has happened sporadically. It's just that when they don't use him in the passing game, they really don't use him. It's nothing.
I hope he does get involved. And just think about what happened last week with the Commanders. They used Austin Eckler as a huge weapon out of the backfield. Maybe they do the same thing the Rams do with Kyren Williams. So hopefully that will help his fantasy production in this matchup. This was going to be the game of the week. I didn't have the song queued up, but we were going to get Dave on this one because I think this is going to be the most fun game to watch, at least of the NFC slate. But a lot of good games for this weekend. Make sure you check out all the action on CBS Sports. Make sure you check out all the action on Paramount Plus. Make sure you check us out Sunday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern on Fantasy Football Today on our YouTube stream. And check out our mailbag episode on Saturday, which you can also watch on YouTube as well. We'll get Adam Mazer back on Sunday night, and we'll all be together for that show. Heath, thanks so much for taking some time on your day off to join us. And thanks, everybody, for watching and listening. Our producer, Claire, I'm sorry for keeping you so long. But that'll do it for us here on Fantasy Football Today.